Mrs. Collins spent her whole life in the city, and now when she finally turned 55, she decided to fulfill her dream. She sold her apartment in the city and bought a small but cozy house on the outskirts of the city. Mrs. Collins was distinguished by hard work and perseverance, so she quickly pasted the wallpapers, put some furniture that was left from the apartment, and tidied up the garden. When she got used to her new place, she decided to get acquainted with the neighbors. Mrs. Smith's house stood right next to Mrs. Collins' house. She was about the same age as her neighbor, but somehow she looked happier. Her garden was always clean and tidy, and the pets, 2 cats and a large shepherd dog, were always well fed and didn't snap at others. Mrs. Collins was beginning to get envious. She saw that the neighbor was doing better with little effort. She watched her and couldn't find anything unusual. She couldn't figure out the reason for her neighbor's eternal happiness. Then she decided to take revenge on the cheerful Mrs. Smith and began to make her way to her garden every night and spoil the beds and pull the flowers out. However, Mrs. Smith didn't seem to notice the trouble, and every morning she went out into the garden with a smile. Mrs. Collins was getting even more angry, but there was nothing she could do. She decided to find out the secret of her love of life and visited Mrs. Smith. The neighbor happily accepted the guest and began to offer her tea while Mrs. Collins asked her questions. To the question, "How do you manage to always be cheerful?" Mrs. Smith replied simply, "I'm learning to see joy in little things." For example, someone comes to my yard every night and pulls out all the weeds from the flower beds. Well, isn't it a miracle? Then Mrs. Collins felt ashamed. She realized that she was not plucking flowers at all for her neighbor, but only weeds, thus only helping to clear the weeds of Mrs. Smith's garden. But the biggest disappointment for her was that while she was trying to take revenge on her neighbor, she completely forgot about her own garden. Everything remained the same. Mrs. Smith's garden smelled like herself, and Mrs. Collins could only pull the weeds out of her garden sadly. Mrs. Collins realized her mistake and asked for forgiveness from the kind neighbor, to which she only smiled, thanked her, and helped to restore her garden. Since then, Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Smith have become real friends. Mrs. Smith taught her neighbor kindness and love of life, and she in return helped with the work in the garden. The most important thing is to be able to see your own shortcomings first, and then to see something wonderful in everything around us. That way, our whole life will become one big miracle.